The upside down is a trauma landscape made physically manifest. It started with flickering lights and a bad feeling Joyce couldn't shake. But what the show revealed over 5 seasons is that the upside down functions as externalized psychological damage given dimensional form. The dimension is literally frozen on November 6th, 1983, the day Will disappeared. It wasn't just a cool supernatural detail, but a perfect metaphor for how trauma freezes people in the moment of their worst experience, unable to move forward or process what happened. Everything in the upside down is toxic, which mirrors how traumatic memories corrupt and poison the past when viewed through the lens of pain. The dimension doesn't just look scary, it looks like what the inside of severe PTSD would be if you could walk through someone's damaged psyche. Fans noticed that characters who've spent time in the upside down carry its contamination long after escaping, which parallels how trauma survivors carry their experiences into normal life, even when the immediate danger has passed. Will coughs up slugs. Max's consciousness gets trapped in Vecna's mindscape. Eleven's powers connect her to that space in ways that never fully sever. The show literalizes the psychological truth that once you've been to hell, part of you stays there even after your body makes it home. But the dimension isn't the only thing representing internal struggles made external. Monsters function as emotional manifestations that target specific psychological wounds. The Demogorgon in Season 1 hunts by blood, which is the show's way of saying it's attracted to vulnerability and weakness. It finds people who are already bleeding, either literally or metaphorically, and finishes what pain started. The Mind Flayer possesses people by exploiting isolation and cold, taking over Will when he's separated from warmth and connection, which represents how depression and trauma can take control when support systems fail. Vecna's curse specifically targets teenagers with unresolved trauma, guilt, and psychological damage, making him less a random monster and more a personification of how untreated mental illness hunts people who are already suffering. Each creature operates on psychological rules disguised as supernatural mechanics, creating a universe where emotional pain literally attracts monsters. Season 4 made this subtext into text by having Max escape Vecna's curse through music and happy memories, the show explicitly stating that connection and joy are weapons against psychological predators. The grandfather clock appears to victims showing specific times tied to their trauma, counting down to when their unprocessed pain will consume them completely if they don't find a way to break the cycle. It's a horror show that functions as a surprisingly accurate trauma metaphor, showing how people can be trapped by their worst memories until someone reaches them with proof that good things exist, worth fighting for. And those patterns emerge from a fundamental truth about every character's motivation. Loss is the engine driving all characters' choices and relationships. Joyce lost her husband to abandonment, and then almost lost Will to the upside down, which turned her into someone who will burn the world down before losing another person she loves. Hopper lost his daughter Sarah to illness, or possibly Brenner's experiments, which made him initially suicidal and self-destructive before Eleven gave him a second chance at being a father, without the guilt of previous failure. Eleven lost her mother to Brenner's torture, which means she's spent the entire series trying to figure out who she is beyond the trauma that defined her formative years. Max lost Billy, and that grief nearly killed her, because she carried guilt about wishing he was dead before it actually happened. The show understands that people aren't defined by what they have, but by what they've lost and how they respond to that absence. Every relationship exists in the shadow of potential loss. The character psychology is built entirely on fear of repetition, on the terror that the worst thing that's already happened will happen again, and this time nobody will survive it. That's what makes the show emotionally resonant beyond its genre elements. It's not about fighting monsters, it's about fighting the knowledge that everyone you love is temporary and you're powerless to prevent the loss. By the way, if you like Stranger Things, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. It helps more than you know. Eleven's entire arc is about the psychology of identity formation under extreme conditions. She was raised without a name, just a number, which is psychological torture that prevents the formation of stable selfhood by denying personhood at the most fundamental level. Brenner called himself Papa while treating her like a weapon, creating a trauma bond mixed with affection and abuse. Eleven spent her childhood learning that her value depended entirely on her powers and obedience, which created identity confusion where she couldn't separate what she could do from who she was as a person. The show chronicles her slow realization that she exists beyond her usefulness, that being 11, the weapon is different from being Jane the person, and that choosing which identity to prioritize is itself an act of resistance against everyone who tried to define her. Her journey mirrors real survivors of childhood trauma trying to construct stable identities from fragments of self that were never allowed to develop naturally. She didn't get to have a childhood where identity forms through play, experimentation, and safe failure. She got torture and expectation, and the constant pressure to perform or be discarded. Watching her learn how to be a teenager in seasons 3 and 4, trying on different styles and personalities while figuring out who she is beyond everyone's projections, is the show's most nuanced psychological portrait. But 11 isn't the only character dealing with long-term psychological damage. Will Byers represents the psychology of ongoing trauma and how it never fully releases its victims. He survived a week in the Upside Down and came back changed in ways that never got fixed, which is psychologically accurate to how major trauma alters brain chemistry and emotional regulation permanently. His sensitivity to the Upside Down in later seasons, touching his neck whenever monsters are near, represents how trauma survivors develop hypervigilance and threat detection that never shuts off even when they're objectively safe. Will can't escape what happened to him because it rewired how his brain processes safety and danger. The show also handles his sexuality with similar psychological complexity, showing how being different in multiple ways, traumatized and gay in 1980s rural Indiana, creates compounding isolation that makes processing either issue harder. Will can't talk about his trauma because nobody wants to keep discussing something that happened years ago, and he can't talk about his sexuality because the culture would destroy him for it, which leaves him stuck carrying multiple secrets that prevent genuine connection with the people closest to him. His character embodies the psychological reality that surviving the worst thing that's ever happened to you doesn't end the story. It just begins a different, longer fight to reclaim normalcy and identity from the wreckage. And Will's isolation connects to the show's broader examination of group psychology. Belonging and group survival are the show's primary psychological defense against horror. The party survives because they refuse to abandon each other even when individuals become liabilities or targets, which runs counter to survival instinct but creates psychological resilience through connection. Every season features moments where the practical choice is leaving someone behind. Will in the Upside Down, 11 after she vanishes, Max in her coma, but the group consistently chooses loyalty over logic because their bond is more important than strategic optimization. This reflects real psychology research showing that social connection is one of the strongest predictors of trauma recovery, that people who maintain relationships through crisis survive psychological damage better than isolated individuals with better resources. The show literalizes this through supernatural mechanics. Eleven's powers work better when she's protecting people she loves. Max escapes Vecna through memories of friends caring about her. Will survives the Upside Down by maintaining connection to his mother through Christmas lights. The message is consistent across 5 seasons. Isolation kills you, connection saves you, and the monsters specifically target people who've been cut off from support systems. It's why Steve's transformation from isolated popular kid to found family. Protector parallels his survival rate improving, and why characters who try to handle things alone consistently fail until they accept help. The psychology is straightforward. Humans are pack animals and trying to survive alone. But the group can't protect against every threat, especially institutional ones. Authority figures consistently fail to protect, creating psychology of learned distrust. Joyce goes to the police, and they dismiss her. Hopper tries to work with the FBI and gets drugged and imprisoned. The kids tell adults about the Upside Down and get sent to therapy or ignored. The show repeatedly demonstrates that institutions and authority figures either can't help or actively make situations worse, which forces characters to develop self-reliance that borders on pathological distrust of anyone in power. By season 5, the military is literally kidnapping children to use as bait, proving that the show's cynicism about institutional protection wasn't paranoia, but accurate threat assessment. This mirrors real childhood trauma psychology, where kids who learn early that adults won't protect them develop hyperindependence and difficulty trusting authority throughout life. The show's kids are forced to become soldiers and strategists before they're old enough to drive because every adult who could have protected them either died, disappeared, or proved incompetent when monsters showed up. That kind of forced maturity creates psychological damage that doesn't present as obvious trauma, but manifests as difficulty with vulnerability, tendency to overfunction in relationships, and inability to ask for help even when drowning. The show doesn't dwell on this, but it's present in how the kids relate to each other versus how they relate to adults. They trust each other absolutely, and trust grown-ups only provisionally, if at all. And that distrust becomes particularly relevant when examining the show's ultimate villain. Vecna embodies the psychology of control and the trauma of being denied autonomy. Henry Creel became a monster specifically because nobody gave him agency over his own life. His family wanted to fix him. Brenner wanted to study him. Everyone treated him as a problem to solve rather than a person with valid feelings about his circumstances. The psychology of his villainy is rooted in this complete lack of control, which manifested as a pathological need to dominate everything around him once he gained power. His philosophy about humanity being dishonest and corrupt stems from growing up in environments where everyone around him performed normalcy while hiding darkness, which taught him that authenticity is impossible and connection is performative lying. His victims are chosen specifically because they remind him of his own lack of control. Teenagers trapped by circumstances, guilt, or trauma they can't escape. He's targeting people whose powerlessness mirrors his own childhood experience, and his curse works by forcing them to relive their trauma until it consumes them completely. Psychologically, he's a damaged person who responded to violation by violating others, which is tragically common in abuse cycles. He's the psychology of untreated trauma taken to its worst possible conclusion. But understanding all this psychology raises a final question about why the show resonates so deeply. The psychology of monsters reflects the specific fears of each developmental stage. What makes Stranger Things psychologically sophisticated is how the threats evolve to match the characters' changing developmental stages, which mirrors how real psychological challenges shift as people mature. Season 1's Demogorgon represented childhood fears. Season 2's Mind Flayer embodied early adolescent fears about losing control of your own body and mind during puberty, when hormones and changes make you feel possessed by something you can't understand or fight. Season 3 introduced relationship anxieties and the fear of growing apart from people you've been close to, which hits hardest during mid-adolescence when friend groups fracture and romantic relationships complicate everything. By Season 4, Vecna targets late adolescent psychological damage, guilt, trauma, depression, the weight of past choices because the characters are old enough to carry real regrets and unprocessed pain that younger children simply don't accumulate yet. The show's monsters mature alongside its cast, which creates the unsettling effect of feeling like the threats are always perfectly calibrated to exploit whatever developmental vulnerability the characters are currently experiencing, making the horror feel personally targeted rather than random. But there's still one more shocking revelation: the psychology of normal being impossible after surviving the extraordinary. One aspect the show handles with brutal honesty is how experiencing the impossible changes people in ways that prevent them from ever returning to baseline normal, which is psychologically accurate to how major trauma creates a permanent before and after division in identity. The party can't relate to classmates who worry about grades and social drama, because those concerns feel trivial when you've literally saved the world multiple times before getting a driver's license. 11 can't pretend to be a regular teenager when she's killed people with her mind and watched friends die in front of her. This creates isolation even when surrounded by people, because normal life feels like a performance where everyone else genuinely cares about things that now seem meaningless after confronting actual apocalyptic stakes. The show depicts this through characters trying and failing to act like nothing happened, Steve attempting to care about his grades, Nancy pretending journalism matters as much as monster hunting, Mike going through the motions of school while his girlfriend fights interdimensional wars. It's the psychology of soldiers returning from combat and finding civilian life unbearably boring and fake. Except these are teenagers who should be worried about prom, but instead have PTSD from fighting creatures most adults don't believe exist. So Stranger Things is ultimately less about the monsters hunting kids in Indiana, and more about the psychological landscape of survival, trauma, identity, and connection that everyone navigates in their own way. Drop a comment about which psychological element resonates most with you.